Y'all, we've been. Blah, 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 blah. College football nerds, bowl content continues. Going to talk Auburn and Minnesota, another fun non-playoff game. And as I said in our Citrus Bowl preview, we love all the bowls. Super excited about a lot of these matchups that don't have anything to do with playoffs. Obviously, great playoff slate too. But we're here to talk about Minnesota and Auburn. I want to remind y'all, please like, please subscribe. And your homework for this video is in the comment section. Give us your score. A lot of times we get great comments from y'all, but we don't get score predictions. And I have to follow up and say, hey, great comment. Let me know your score prediction. Also, want to let you know, because you may not know this, we have an audio version if you would prefer to listen to the podcast and not watch me talk or read my statistical errors that I always make in the info cards. You can always just listen, and ignorance is bliss. Okay, Josh, we're going to probably get killed this video because it's going to have a little bit of an Auburn slant. I'm going to warn people a little bit. We will get into some positives with Minnesota as well. I don't love how Minnesota ended the season. I do love their season overall. I do love a lot of the makeup of this team, and they actually really surprised me, not just in beating Penn State, but how the team's fans really got behind this team. And I think in a way that we probably weren't expecting. That was a fun game to watch. Stumbled down the stretch with Iowa and Wisconsin. But the big concern, and we were talking about this when we were working through talking points for this game, we're not high on Auburn's offense. We haven't been all year. Auburn fans have killed us for it all year. We've been right all year. And before you bring up the Alabama game, we're going to remind you that offensively you didn't perform that great. And Alabama's defense kind of sucks right now. But anyway, one thing you noted, I'll let you get into the specifics, was Minnesota has played Penn State, Wisconsin in a certain offensive scoring ranking sphere, and then there's a huge cliff that they fall off of in terms of the opponents they faced. Auburn is up more close to those couple of decent offenses they face and not near all the bad offenses they faced. So talk about those numbers, and then talk about whether or not that concerns you going into this game against Auburn.
So this is the statistic I dug up on it, okay? So when you look at Minnesota and the Big Ten in general, there are really 5, arguably 6 teams that can score points in the Big Ten. It's Ohio State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Penn State, Michigan, maybe Indiana, depending on who the quarterback is. Of that list, obviously Minnesota is one of the teams. Minnesota didn't have to play Ohio State, and they played Wisconsin, they played Penn State, they played Michigan, did not play Indiana. Those teams, in terms of national scoring offense, okay, Wisconsin's 21, Penn State is 22. The next best team, P5 team, that if you're Minnesota that you played, is Nebraska. Nebraska's 72nd. So the two teams that were 21 and 22, in those games you gave up over 7 yards per play, 7.1 yards per play to Penn State, 7.95 yards, almost 8 yards per play to Wisconsin, 38 points to Wisconsin, 26 points in a win against Penn State. Now, admittedly, it was a win, but there were a lot of turnovers that came in. You gave up over 500 yards of offense to Penn State, and they basically threw the game away. You did that, and you made that happen, but it's still a concern. When we're talking about predictive stuff, if you're giving up a lot of yards and then you just, you win anyway because of turnovers, the turnover part's really variable. The yardage part tends to be the thing that gets repeated more often than not, and we're pretty consistent with this point. So the point I'm making really is that, Iowa is not in that group. Iowa's offense is kind of putrid, frankly. They're a very good defense.
99th.
Yeah, they're a putrid 99th scoring offense. Auburn, where do they fit into that, okay? You have these two teams in a cliff. Auburn is 27th. So they are right there with Wisconsin and Penn State, 21st, 22nd. We can talk about whether the defenses are worse or better or whatnot in the SEC or Big Ten. I will say that argument, which will rage in the comment section, is unprovable, absent a lot of data points, because if the offenses are better, you're going to give up more points. If the offenses are worse, you're going to give up fewer points. Or maybe it's the defense. You will never know. It's like evaluating a spring scrimmage. You can evaluate it team versus team within a conference. It's almost impossible to evaluate teams in other conferences or conferences against each other. But the point here is there's an indication that Auburn is much closer to the Penn State and Wisconsin game than they are the rest of them. And defensively, Minnesota is a very good defense. You have 5.1 yards per play. That's really not an elite number, frankly, but it is a good number. But the key, to me, one of the keys here is that when they face defenses or offenses over a certain level, and we see this a lot, it kind of caved, and they looked a lot more mortal. And you especially see this with well-coached defenses that maybe aren't as talented as some other units in terms of blue chip talent, because being really well-coached, like Notre Dame, several of their defenses were really good in playoff era years, and they were statistically really good. And then they face an elite offense and they get drilled because all of a sudden now you just can't win your man-on-man matchups, your one-on-ones, and stuff starts to get exploited. Auburn is not a great offense, but they do score a lot, and they have a lot of speed and a lot of talent, and that's a concern. And I think that's the thing with Michigan. And this is not a Big Ten versus SEC thing. Let me be really clear, okay? There were 7 teams in the Big Ten that had a winning record this year. You didn't play Indiana. You didn't play Ohio State. You are Minnesota. So of those 7, you played Michigan. You played Wisconsin. You played Iowa. You're 1-2 in those games with a close win over Iowa, a close loss, or a close win over Penn State, a close loss to Iowa, and a big-time loss to Wisconsin. 1-2 versus teams with a winning record. 1-2 teams against a winning record over the entirety of the season. Minnesota did have a weak schedule. They did have a weak schedule regardless of what conference they're in. It's not an anti-Big Ten thing. That's what concerns me going against an Auburn team that is of the class of Wisconsin, Penn State, and Iowa, and they are much closer offensively to Penn State and Wisconsin than they are Iowa. But they have a defense that's as good or better than Iowa's.
And you said they played Michigan, and then you immediately followed up that they played Penn State. I know they will get you in the comments, so I wanted to make sure that they acknowledge that.
I'm looking at a sheet of paper, and I read the line under the line that I sorry. Yes.
This was the issue we had with Minnesota going into the Penn State game, and it turned out that they beat Penn State. Minnesota fans absolutely killed us for saying we have question marks because you're undefeated going into this game, but you have not played anyone. And it is absolutely true. And this is kind of our frustration with the lack of external data points outside of your conference. Minnesota played nobody out of conference. They didn't play a Power 5 team. Wisconsin, so we're talking about this bubble of teams. Wisconsin didn't play a Power 5 team out of conference. Iowa played Iowa State. It was a 1-point game. I think Iowa State's better than they're giving credit. And Penn State played Pitt. And won by 7. So these 4 teams that are all kind of clumped together have between them the 2 data points out of conference of a 7-point win over Pitt and a 1-point win over Iowa State. And it's frustrating because
it took a muff punt for Iowa.
It's frustrating because we get killed for acknowledging that, but we would acknowledge the same thing for the SEC. It's not an SEC thing like you said, but when you look at Auburn, who they've played, and the teams that are clumped around them, the only really bad one is Alabama, and they played Duke, and they killed them. But Duke's not a good team. I'm not giving them a pat on the back for that. But, Georgia played Notre Dame, Georgia Tech out of conference. Florida played Florida State, Miami out of conference. Like, the teams that are clumped around Auburn have, 10 games out of conference against Power 5 teams. I don't want to belabor that point. I just want to talk about why this is why there's a question mark around Minnesota. This is why there's a question mark around Penn State. It's not that question mark means you suck. The question mark means we don't know, because what you're saying is, trust us, we're good, we're 10-2. And we're like, okay, the teams you've played, who have they played? And they're like, well, they've played other teams that haven't played anybody. Well, that doesn't tell us anything. Even Ohio State, who we think is elite, and we have number 1, didn't play a Power 5 team out of conference. So it's not so much that we think you suck or the Big Ten sucks. We actually don't think the Big Ten sucks. It's that we are desperate to get better data out of conference, and this is our criticism of the 9-game conference schedule. Okay, so we gave a little poke at Auburn's offense to start this off, and probably lost half of our Auburn viewers and listeners. But first, talk about, is our season-long criticism. Well, don't talk about it. Our season-long criticism of the Auburn offense is fair. They killed us early on in the season, and it proved out we were right. They explained away the Tulane game and some other games, proved we were right. But I will say I'm encouraged by not necessarily. This is the one thing I'm gonna let you talk about. Because I've always been critical of Gus Malzahn's offenses in years that they were bad in red zone touchdowns. And against Alabama, and their 2 scores against Georgia, and a lot of these other games, like red zone not settling for field goals seems to be improved this year for Gus. And for all the struggles that Auburn has, they are moving the ball pretty well in between the 20s. So is that something that you think they can build on and look for in this game? Or do you still have concerns about Auburn's offense?
Can I say both? Because the answer is kind of both.
Yeah, you can. If you explain it, back it up with data.
So we've talked about before, the canary in the coal mine for Auburn offensively is their ability to score touchdowns in the red zone. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty simple. Auburn's offense is predicated off an offensive line that's able to get push, because they have to be able to get push to run some of the power concepts and zone read concepts they want to run offensively, because everything kind of works inside out. I've talked about this a million times with Auburn. They need to do the inside run to make the outside run work. And when they get the outside run to work correctly, that forces edge defenders to crash on the outside run to contain it. That opens up the jet sweep, because if the guys are holding down the edge, that means they can't, like if you're pinning an offensive tackle, you can't then get off the offensive tackle and deal with Schwartz coming around the edge. And so that jet sweep opens up. And then when that jet sweep opens up, you got to pull down the safety deal with that. And now all of a sudden you get a passing game. Bang, 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 bang. That's how the offense works. When they get in the red zone and they can't score, it's usually because they can't run. Because the big time, their chunk plays have kind of always been there. It's a little bit of the function of the offense. Malzahn's able to conjure up points sometimes. I've probably said this 1,000 times this season, but mostly in Florida videos. We picked the Auburn-Florida game wrong, and Florida fans really gave us crap about it up until they lost to LSU, and then they just shut up and stopped listening. The point I made in that video is I said Auburn would win the game. I thought they're going to win it in the fourth quarter, and I thought they were going to win it because they were going to find a way to get, you could call it a cheap score or really a quick score is the point, some like 80-yard score. What ended up happening is P. Ryan ended up having that score instead of Auburn. Otherwise, if that goes the other way, Auburn wins. That's always kind of been there. But if you're relying on that, you're not likely to win. If you're Auburn, you need to be able to get the push to make yourself win. And the red zone conversion doesn't really make your team good. It's a symptom of how everything else works. Because when you're able to score in the red zone, that means all that power run stuff usually works when you're Auburn. It means the offense is functioning well because you can't run all those gimmicks and tricks that are a viable part of an offense, but you just can't run them inside the 20-yard line very effectively. Red zone offense for Auburn right now, 72% touchdown conversion percentage. Auburn has not been over 70% since 2013. They were 72% in 2013. And we really hammered on this point. Last year they were 60%, 64% in 2017, so there was a slight dip. 2016, they were 56. 2015, 62. Again, getting back up, 65%, 2014, 72%, 2013, 2012, 50%. It tracks very heavily with Auburn's success, and it's due to scheme. And I know 2012 wasn't the same offense, but 2011 was, again, 60%. Okay, 2010, 67. When you're 65, 75%, you're really good. When you're below, you're bad. So all the other numbers aside, Auburn has that going for them. Now, here's the problem. The red zone numbers are up because the rushing offense is actually operating at a very high level in itself. They can do the stuff they want to do. And is the rushing offense often by itself? The passing game is almost completely ineffective for Auburn. And again, when you're in the red zone, it kind of equalizes because you don't really throw the ball anyway, the way the passing offense works. So it kind of looks like it always looks like. But in the rest of the field, Auburn just can't throw the ball. 6.8 yards per attempt. Even the Alabama game where they put up 48 points, Bo Nix was 5.6 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown. 15 of 31 passing, 48%. They won that game because they could run the ball. They ran the ball for, let me see, 34 times, 181 yards, 5.3 yards per carry. Alabama has not allowed over 5 yards per carry in a long time. That was one of the more interesting statistics. And you hear us bashing the Alabama defense. It's a whole different story in the Alabama-Michigan game. Their defense has collapsed. But Auburn is actually a very pretty potent rushing attack, but they're a very limited passing attack. And the run part works, but the passing offense is actually probably more broken than normal. And I would say if the passing offense worked at a higher level, and I may take heat for this when I'm going to say it, I'm not sure it wasn't more functional under Jeremy Johnson at quarterback than it is right now. The difference is Bo Nix has a far better supporting cast and a far more functional offense around him. And the passing game is just really weak. And if they had, well, maybe not Jeremy Johnson, maybe that's an extreme, but let's say Sean White. If they had Sean White at quarterback this year, this would actually be, top 5 in the SEC offense. I mean, a yard per play, they're like in the 70s. I think they're like 78th or something. I mean, they're scoring kind of despite the fact that they're not moving the ball well, and they're not moving it all that great because the passing game isn't great. They would be a top 30 offense in almost every stat if they could throw the ball well. So that's the whole gist of Auburn. I think it's an interesting story looking at the pass over the course of the season, and I think it's kind of sad, really, when you unpack it and look at, this Auburn team could have been a playoff competitive team, but for the fact that they cannot throw for jack squat, but for the fact that they didn't hit 6 yards per attempt in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 games this year. You got to hit, if you go 5 and 7 at hitting 6 yards per attempt in a game, you're probably not going to have a great season. And they went 9 and 3 in spite of that fact.
So those things are, for me, good and bad. Like you said, it's a little bit of both. The fact that they can score without the passing production is pretty impressive. It does show, it speaks to future headroom. But that doesn't say where we are. Where we are right now is who we've got in Auburn. But the positive, if I'm an Auburn fan, is the last game that Minnesota played, they played a team that couldn't really throw it. They played a team that was a physical, downhill running team that struggles at quarterback, and they still beat Minnesota pretty soundly. So there's some positives there. I will, in Minnesota's defense, I will say that there's a lot of rumbling coming from not only the Auburn camp, but the SEC camp that, last year Purdue beat Ohio State, and look what Auburn did to them. It was 56-7 at the half. Can you just put that to bed now and just let Auburn fans know and everybody know this Minnesota team ain't 2018 Purdue?
Sure. And I think that's pretty justifiable. When you look at Purdue at the end of 2018, okay, they had given up 41 to Minnesota, 47 to Wisconsin. They beat Indiana. They given up 36 to Iowa. They weren't a good defense, and that had shown up several times. I mean, Auburn's 7.8 yards per play was a little more than a Wisconsin team that was not very good had generated against Purdue in a win, 47-44. Purdue just wasn't a good team at the end of 2018. Auburn took advantage of it, and then they kind of ran away with it. And their style of offense is built to exploit bad defenses. And Purdue was at a level of bad defense where they could be just sort of broken. Really, Purdue was a team that had no business beating Ohio State. And I would say generally, if they don't beat Ohio State, I mean, they were 6-6, right? So they don't even make a bowl. So there's a lot going on there, and I think you got to be careful not to draw too much from it, as you're saying. I mean, Minnesota's a good team. They're a physical team. They're a well-coached team. They've been well-motivated. I have been a very vocal critic of PJ Fleck. I'm going to sort of hold my breath on that a little bit because I got proven maybe a little wrong this year. I don't know. Again, I pointed out you went 1-2 against teams with a winning record, and I know they were really good, but you only played 3 of them, and you kind of got the Alabama problem. That you
didn't play 3 great ones.
That's true. Alabama lost, but they lost to 2 top 10 teams. I mean, they lost to number 1 and they lost to a top 10 team. You didn't play anyone as good as anyone that Alabama played. Probably. I mean, I guess Wisconsin, Auburn, you can have that debate. But Yeah, it's hard to judge because I think Minnesota is a motivated, well-coached team, but are they a great team? I don't mean good, because good ain't going to win this game. Are you a great team? That's a much harder question.
And there's a gap between great and elite. So I don't think you got to be a top 4 team to beat Auburn. But I do think you got to be a pretty good offense to score on that Auburn defense. And people are going to point to that last game where defensively Auburn gave up 38 points. One of the scores that Auburn gave up was a punt return or kickoff return. I'm concerned about Minnesota. I don't think Auburn's going to run away with this game, and I don't think they're going to score a ton of points. I'm concerned about Minnesota's ability to score against a team that's more physical, that seems to be still motivated. Auburn's, all their players are playing. Nobody's sitting out for this game. That kind of surprised me a little bit. Minnesota's got players sitting out, so that surprised me a little bit.
I think Nick Coe actually just announced that he's going to sit out.
Okay. Interesting. When their highest draft pick player is not sitting out. Okay, so let's get into the model, talk about the numbers, see what the score looks like on paper, and then we'll pivot off of that.
So we do a model that's a per play model. We've done both teams. You've heard the Shul before, but the 90-second version for people less familiar. We look at how you did against your opponents, how your opponents did against everybody else. Build a profile unique to your team, and look at the particular matchups in this game. So we're putting in all the numbers, saying, yeah, this is what you're like relative to your competition. If you both play your B-plus game, what does the score look like? And building a scoring model that's unique to each team, letting the computer decide what has or has not mattered in your past games in terms of you scoring points. So every team's kind of evaluated a little differently. That's a key point because it affects how the numbers play out here. First stat that our model generates is this percentage of opponent averages allowed. I mean, Auburn's allowing 74% of opponent rush averages, 78% of opponent passing averages. That's a very, very good pass number. That's an elite pass defense number. 74% is very good run D. The best defenses, like the Ohio States, are going to be in the 50% range. I think, interestingly, LSU's viewed as this bad defense, but LSU's actually at 80%, Auburn's at 74%. The gap is not all that significant. Granted, it has more to do with LSU being underrated. So that's just kind of a total aside. Minnesota, their numbers are not really great. 87% of rushing averages, 99% of passing averages. This is a neutral stat that's just balanced against your opponents. The point is, Minnesota's averaging allows you to have exactly your passing average. Their good pass defense numbers, they allow 6.7 yards per attempt, is merely because their opponent average is 6.7 yards per attempt. That's over a yard worse than Auburn. Auburn's opponents average 7.8. Minnesota's average 6.8. I often like to do this and say, okay, well, what does that number mean? Well, if you were to look at nationally, like yard per attempt average, okay, Auburn's opponent, 7.8 yards per attempt, is around 42nd. That's Notre Dame, effectively. That's Auburn's average passing opponent. 6.7 yards per attempt drops you all the way down to 96th. It's like Cal. And you know who else is 6.7 yards per attempt? Auburn. So basically, Auburn's like an average passing defense for what Minnesota's faced. I mean, as bad as Auburn is passing the ball, and I'm sorry, they're pretty bad, it's normal for what Minnesota's faced. It's not going to be any worse than what Minnesota's faced normally. It's not better, but it's not really going to be unusually bad. The difference is the run defenses, the run offenses are better. But again, Minnesota allowing right at passing average, which means Auburn should get theirs. Whatever that is. And then, 87% against the run is just merely okay, good. That number should be better. So basically Minnesota's numbers, I'm telling you, statistically are almost entirely a byproduct of the quality of the offenses they've faced. They're allowing right at their averages. It's just simply their opponents have not been very good. And when you look at the two offenses in this game, the key really is that Auburn's defense is much better than Minnesota's. And so the advantage Minnesota has offensively, and they are a good offense, and we kind of didn't talk about that too much, over 10 yard per attempt average. Minnesota's a good offense. It is negated heavily by how much better Auburn is defensively. So 4 yard per carry expected for Auburn. Minnesota's only expected to get about 3. Now 8 yards per attempt for Minnesota is effective passing the ball. We like to see that ball number a little higher if you're going to be really effective, but effective enough. but just not able to run it. And so Auburn's expected to have about 5.2 yards per play to about 5 yards per play for Minnesota. The interesting thing is it actually has Minnesota winning despite being outgained 30-25. And that's the sort of takeaway here. The scoring models are unique to each team. It's not a like point per yard situation. It's a lot more complicated than that. But it does come down to the fact that Minnesota is more efficient scoring than Auburn. Auburn kind of wastes a lot of points when they're in this yardage range. This year they've needed a lot of yards to score points, and they've stalled a lot. And again, it's really due to the inability to convert third downs in the passing game. Whereas Minnesota can convert third downs in the passing game, so they score a little more readily for the same yardage. That's what the model is saying.
And I'm not entirely surprised at the model, given that the schedules are so starkly different. When you consider the fact that Auburn played the Pac-12 champion, they played the SEC champion, they just beat probably before the injuries, the second best team in the SEC. And then they've played Georgia. They're just so different. And that's not a shot at Minnesota, because Minnesota's playing who's on their schedule. And I do think that I predicted the Iowa loss partly because of hangover and partly because Iowa, the matchup was not great. And they're very similar. I think Iowa's not as good as Auburn offensively, but Iowa's really bad offensively. But I actually think Iowa has a little bit better defense than Auburn. And Auburn fans are going to scoff at this, but I'm super impressed with what Iowa's doing defensively. They remind me a lot of Michigan State the last couple of years in that they're putting up top 5, top 10 defensive numbers in a lot of categories, in spite of the fact that their defense is on the field the entire game because their offense is so freaking bad. People don't understand what I was doing defensively. It's actually really impressive. The game that scares me is the Wisconsin game, because it's not that they lost to Wisconsin by a few points. It's that they got run against a team that has a very similar makeup. Auburn's defense is better, more physical, more athletic than Wisconsin. Maybe not quite as fundamentally sound. Maybe they are. And offense is very similar. It's one of those situations, and I'm going to go ahead and give my pick. It's one of those situations where I actually like Minnesota. I hate the draw. I don't like the matchup. I would rather see Minnesota play a Texas A&M type of team than an Auburn team if they're drawing somebody at the SEC. Not because Texas A&M is lower on the totem pole, but because of the scheme they play and the style of offense or defense and the personnel makeup. I think Auburn is just a little more, I don't know, they're a little more physical than some of the other teams that I think Minnesota could beat. I think it's been a great year for Minnesota, and they could completely shock me in this game. And you know what Minnesota fans are going to say? They're going to say your model had us beating Penn State, and y'all picked against us, and you should have stuck with your model. I'm going to pick against them again here, and I will gladly tweet at y'all, eat all the crow in the world, Minnesota fans, if we are wrong. I got Auburn 28, Minnesota 17. I don't think Auburn runs away with it. I don't think they score a whole lot in this game, partly because of limitations of offense, partly because Minnesota's a good football team. 28-17. Tell me what you got.
I do have Auburn winning this game, and I'll say 32-25, Auburn over Minnesota. It's a 7-point spread, so I'm right at the line. That's just kind of where I'm at with it. I think it's interesting that Auburn has the same line that Alabama has over Michigan. And we talked about how that game may be a lot closer than maybe some people think. I think this one is more on the money. And I think what's interesting to me is the perception is maybe that this is something of a closer game and that Alabama is going to win by a lot. I mean, Auburn, I think, has as many advantages over Minnesota as Alabama has over Michigan. And we've talked a lot all season that Minnesota is a good team. They're a well-coached team. They're a solid team, but there's a sort of a ceiling you hit once you start hitting top 15, top 10, top 5. And it's hard sometimes for people to appreciate it because you can only have you can only have 5 top 5 teams. You can only have 10 top 10 teams. The problem for Minnesota is that maybe we're losing people. There's kind of a hard line at the 15 mark this year where to hit that group you got to have a certain level of core talent and athleticism. And Minnesota has some guys. I mean, they've got good receivers. We didn't really talk about it, right now, but Minnesota has a good receiving core. They've got a great quarterback in Morgan. They're going to be able to normally throw the ball pretty well, but against Auburn is not going to shut them down in the passing game, but Auburn's defense is good enough to hold, to keep Johnson from scoring, as many points as he wants to score. And without that being an edge, I don't know where Minnesota holds up in the other parts of the game, because I don't think that, Bateman and Johnson can just carry them if the run game isn't great, if the offensive line is going to be at a serious disadvantage, because everyone's offensive line is at a disadvantage against Auburn. The defense is going to be kind of outmanned at most every position in terms of just sheer athleticism, and you end up losing. And I think that's where Minnesota's at. But it's a testament that they are in this game, and I think they are in this game. And I think they're kind of playing above their heads. And this is sort of the line where they can establish themselves and say, it wasn't a fluke. My guess is they play really hard and they still lose because they just can't man-to-man stay with Auburn. I think they play better than Auburn does for the talent level, but this is kind of right at the ceiling of where they can perform. And again, we had the same thought against Penn State. They beat Penn State. They beat Penn State close in a game Penn State had a chance to win. It's going to have to be a similar game for them to come out and beat Auburn, I think.
Yeah, and we always talk about what happens if this game's a blowout. I don't see it. I really don't. I think that Vegas has a good feel for this game, and I think the fan aspect is weighing too heavily in this. And we had some of this when Auburn played UCF. I think that Auburn fans remember Purdue a whole lot, and that was a fun game, and they think that they're putting this Minnesota team in the same bucket, and I don't think that's fair. I will say this. I'll say this because I've kind of done the opposite in the past. I think this game is closer than maybe Auburn fans think, and it doesn't say anything bad about Auburn. It says something good about Minnesota. Is that fair to say?
I would agree with that.
So Auburn fans are going to take this video maybe a little bit that we're negative on your team, but we're really saying you're a quarterback away from being in the playoffs this year. And that quarterback next year might be Bo Nix. He might really turn the corner, and this year of experience might be great. It's just we see a Tua when he was a true freshman or a Trevor Lawrence when they were a true freshman and think that now that all the true freshman quarterbacks are ready to go. I don't think so. I think that Bo Nix was thrown in the fire, and it was just a little more than almost any true freshman could handle. If you remember, Trevor Lawrence and Tua came along and got to be behind someone for a little while before it was on their shoulders. Bo Nix had a huge game out of the gate, won the game, but he never had that chance to really comfortably kind of slide into this role. So I think a lot was expected of him. And it's just a lot to expect out of somebody in one season, in their first season. So that's all we've got for this one. Let us know in the comments, as we said in the open. Give us your score. Don't just give us your opinion on the game or how you hate the SEC or how the Big Ten's overrated. Give us a score prediction so we can come back and laugh at you if you're wrong, or you can come back and laugh at us because you got the score right. You got it on paper. And you can let us know how we were wrong. Thanks so much, y'all, for hanging out this week, this long. Y'all have a great one. God bless.